learned friend, Mr. Free, assisted by Ms. Boston, Ms. Amundsen and Mr. Winter, for the 31st case study to hear the evidence of retired Bishop Geoffrey Robinson.
Yes, Ms. Needham, do you seek leave to appear?
Your Honour, I understand leave has been granted.
And who are you appearing for?
Appearing for the Truth, Justice and Healing Council and for the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference.
Very well. There's no one else, I take it?
No, Your Honour.
Yes, Ms. Finney.
Thank you, Your Honour. As I indicated, this is the 31st case study, the subject of a public hearing. Its purpose is to hear the evidence of retired Bishop Geoffrey Robinson. Bishop Robinson's evidence is expected to canvass his experience as a priest in the 1970s, as an auxiliary bishop in the Archdiocese of Sydney for 2 decades, and his involvement in the development of the more recent approach of the Catholic Church to child sexual abuse by its clergy and religious. There will be no submissions following Bishop Robinson's evidence. Instead, his evidence will be relevant to the Royal Commission's broader consideration of the response of the Catholic Church to matters of child sexual abuse by its clergy and religious. This broader consideration will likely be the subject of a case study in early 2017. Submissions will follow from that case study. Bishop Robinson was ordained as a priest in the Archdiocese of Sydney in December 1960. He later taught canon law and was the president of the Canon Law Society of Australia and New Zealand. Bishop Robinson was appointed auxiliary bishop in the Archdiocese of Sydney in 1984 and held that position until July 2004. He was a member of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, which I will refer to as the Conference, during that time. He was also a member of the Archdiocese of Sydney College of Consultors from December 1985, initially under Archbishop Clancy. Bishop Robinson is expected to give evidence of his knowledge and experience of how the Archdiocese of Sydney handled complaints and concerns about child sexual abuse in the 1970s and beyond. Bishop Robinson was a member of the conference when it established the Special Issues Committee in 1988. Its purpose was to develop a protocol to guide Catholic Church authorities' responses when an accusation was made against a priest or religious of criminal behaviour. The committee was also charged with identifying treatment options and monitoring all legal proceedings involving a priest or religious. Bishop Robinson was not a member of that committee. That committee was chaired for the first 2 years by Bishop Mulcairns, the Bishop of Ballarat. The first protocol developed by the committee was approved in principle by the conference in May 1990, and various amendments and consultations occurred until what became known as the 1992 protocol was approved. That protocol itself was the subject of further consultation, and draft principles were developed in late 1993. Bishop Robinson is expected to give evidence that he felt an increasing unease that the committee did not seem to be producing the protocols the Church needed. In May 1994, he was asked to be a member of the Bishops' Committee for Professional Standards, the successor to the Special Issues Committee. Bishop Robinson understood he had a special personal mandate from the leaders of the conference to accelerate the work of responding to child sexual abuse occurring within the Catholic Church. His first work was to draft a statement of principles and a revised protocol. During the development of these principles, a number of matters caused significant debate within the Church. They included the return to ministry of priests or religious who had been convicted of or had admitted to child sexual abuse, reporting to secular authorities, and the emphasis which should be placed on victims and the rights and responsibilities of offenders. Bishop Robinson was a member of the Bishops' Committee for some years and for 6 years was co-chair of the National Committee for Professional Standards, which was the successor to the Bishops' Committee. The National Committee was established at the same time Towards Healing was approved for implementation in March 1997. Towards Healing has been considered in earlier case studies by the Royal Commission. Its stated intent is to give individuals the opportunity to tell their story to somebody in authority in the Church, receive an apology and be offered pastoral care and reparation. Bishop Robinson is expected to say that before Towards Healing was finalised and made public, the Archbishop of Melbourne, the largest diocese in the country, and I quote, suddenly and out of nowhere announced that he was setting up a different process in his diocese. This disconcerted everyone, for it would have helped us greatly if we had all worked together and be seen to be working together. Under the leadership of Bishop Robinson, the National Committee created and subsequently reviewed and amended Towards Healing. Bishop Robinson has published works and papers and books on the issue of prevention of future abuse, and he is expected to provide his opinions on issues such as obligatory celibacy, the absence of women from key positions of influence in the Church, professionalism among priests and religious, and the role of the confessional. During his time on the Bishops' Committee for Professional Standards, there was agreement to the establishment of a national therapy program for priests and religious. Ultimately, in 1997, Encompass Australasia began operations. Bishop Robinson will give evidence about Encompass, including its response to a summons from the police to produce documents about clients. Bishop Robinson is also expected to give evidence about the role of canon law in relation to child sexual abuse by clergy and religious. Throughout its long history, the Catholic Church has repeatedly condemned the sexual abuse of children, including by clerics. Relevant provisions since the beginning of the 20th century include, in 1917, Pope Benedict XV promulgated the first Code of Canon Law. It created a number of canonical crimes, or delex, including adultery, debauchery, sodomy, bestiality, and the sexual abuse of children. It also provided for clerics accused of such crimes to be tried before a canonical court. In 1922, Pope Pius XI issued the secret instruction which came to be known as Crimen Solicitationis. It placed cases of soliciting in the confessional, homosexuality, bestiality and child sexual abuse by priests within the jurisdiction of the Holy Office, and imposed the secret of the Holy Office on all information obtained during canonical inquiries and trials of such cases. The secret of the Holy Office was a permanent silence that bound not only the bishop and those involved in the canonical inquiries and trials, but victims and witnesses who were sworn to observe the secret on pain of automatic excommunication that could only be lifted by the Pope personally. In dealing with clergy accused of any of the delex covered by Crimen Solicitationis, bishops were required to take a pastoral and therapeutic approach. Dismissal was only available in more serious cases where there was no possibility of reform. Crimen Solicitationis was reissued in 1962 by Pope John XXIII and expanded to cover priests who were members of religious orders. Now, in 1971, under Pope Paul VI, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith issued an instruction that bishops could petition the congregation for administrative laicization or dismissal of a priest for living a depraved life, which would have included the sexual abuse of children. In 1974, Pope Paul VI issued an instruction called the Secreta Continiare. It changed the name of the secret of the Holy Office to the Pontifical Secret and expanded it to cover delex against faith and morals, including child sexual abuse by clergy, religious brothers and sisters, and laypersons. It further expanded the strictest secrecy to cover not only the information obtained through a canonical inquiry and trial, but also the allegation itself. Secreta continuare has remained in force ever since. In 1980, Pope John Paul II abolished administrative laicization, the only method now available under canon law to dismiss a priest from the priesthood was through judicial trial. Only the accused priest could voluntarily apply for laicization. In 1983, Pope John Paul II issued a revised Code of Canon Law which incorporated the pastoral and therapeutic approach to clergy sexual abuse first introduced in Crimen Solicitationis, thus making it more difficult for local bishops to permanently remove clergy guilty of child sexual abuse. While Crimen Solicitationis was in force, there had been no limitation period for bringing child sex abuse cases. Now, under the 1983 Code, the limitation period became 5 years from the date of the incident, as originally provided for under the 1917 Code. The 1974 instruction, that is the Secreta continuare, remained in force, meaning that the pontifical secret still applied to child sex abuse cases. Bishop Robinson had various dealings with the Vatican, particularly from 1996 until his retirement in 2004, in relation to child sexual abuse and canon law. In 1996, he told an international conference on sexual abuse that he was not satisfied with the level of support and assistance the Church in Australia was receiving from Rome on the issue of sexual abuse by the clergy and religious. The Apostolic Nuncio wrote to him in terms Bishop Robinson considered condemnatory. Bishop Robinson is expected to give evidence about that correspondence. In 1999, Bishop Robinson agitated for a meeting of bishops from English-speaking countries at the Vatican on the theme of clerical sexual abuse. The Secretariat of State decided to hold such a meeting over 3 days in April 2000. 2 bishops from each country's bishops' conference were invited to present a 25-minute synthesis covering the previous 5 years and providing statistics of accusations and outcomes under civil and canon law and the proportion of those convicted as against total numbers of clergy. The purpose was said to be to provide concrete suggestions to the Pope. Bishop Robinson and Bishop Philip Wilson, then Bishop of Wollongong, attended from the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. Bishop Robinson will give evidence about the information provided by the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference to the meeting and his personal observations of how the meeting was conducted and what it achieved. The conflict between canon law and civil law, insofar as towards healing was concerned in particular, was the theme of the Australian report. Bishop Robinson observed that the Roman authorities' level of understanding was a long way behind and that most in Rome still saw the problem as a moral one. He noted an overriding concern to preserve existing legal processes. The obligations of the Church towards victims tended not to be considered, he observed. He quoted from a document prepared by the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, and I quote, "The Church cannot let itself be influenced by public opinion, at times deliberately stirred up, in order to adapt itself to the mentality and way of acting of the secular world." After that meeting on 30 April 2001, Pope John Paul II issued a personal decree known as the Motu Proprio, which directed that after carrying out a preliminary investigation, if the local ordinary had at least probable knowledge that the allegation of sexual abuse of minors under 18 years of age was true, he was to refer the case to the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which would then give further instructions about how each case was to approve. This extended also the limitation period for bringing cases to 10 years from the victim's 18th birthday, and reaffirmed that the pontifical secret still applied. In Australia, in November 2002, the National Committee for Professional Standards carried a motion that the bishops and congregational leaders recommit towards healing as the normal means of responding to complaints of abuse. That motion included that where a cleric strongly denies the allegations, then, on a case-by-case basis, the use of canonical process can be considered. In those cases where it was decided to commence a canonical process, the towards healing process would provide the preliminary investigation under the relevant canons. This was not consistent with the 2001 motu proprio. In 2010, Pope Benedict XVI revised the motu proprio so that a priest should be punished according to the gravity of his crime, not excluding dismissal or deposition from the priesthood. It further extended the limitation period to 20 years after the victim's 18th birthday, and again reaffirmed that clergy child sexual abuse cases are covered by the pontifical secret. On 12 April 2010, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith issued a document entitled A Guide to Understanding Basic Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith Procedures Concerning Sexual Abuse Allegations, which stated that local ordinaries should comply with civil laws requiring the reporting of sexual abuse where such laws exist. The congregation then asked each bishops' conference, including the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference, to prepare and submit national guidelines to assist member bishops to follow clear and coordinated procedures for dealing with abuse of minors by clergy. In May 2012, the Australian Conference did so. In February 2013, the Apostolic Nuncio wrote on behalf of the congregation to the chair of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference and provided observations on the Australian guidelines. The congregation observed that there is a requirement that all accusations of sexual abuse of a minor be forwarded to the Australian guidelines. The congregation observed that there is a requirement that all congregation also made observations to the effect that the existing detailed procedures for assessing allegations of child sexual abuse, which are outlined in Towards Healing, do not apply to ordained clergy. Further, that while the bishop or superior may discuss future options with a cleric or religious who has admitted to or been found guilty of child sexual abuse, ultimately the final decision rests with the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome. These matters will be the subject of evidence. Your Honour, can I seek a short adjournment in order to have the cameras removed and then return with Bishop Robinson's evidence?
Yes, let me know when you're ready.
Thank you. Thank you, Bishop Robinson.
Bishop, it will be necessary for you to be sworn. Will you take an oath from the Bible?
Certainly.
I think there's a Bible there. Take it in your hand, please. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give in this royal commission
that the evidence I shall give in this royal commission
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Take a seat. Yes, Ms. Finnis.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes.
Your full name
My full name is Geoffrey James Robinson.
and you're retired?
I am a retired auxiliary bishop, yes.
Thank you. Now, you were born bishop in 1937
Yes,
and you were ordained as a priest in the Archdiocese of Sydney in December 1960.
correct.
Where did you attend as a seminarian?
Sorry.
Which seminary did you attend?
I was first of all at St Columba's College in Springwood, which is the seminary for the Archdiocese, the minor seminary. Then in 1985 I transferred to Rome and attended I was in the Clergy de Propaganda Fide.
Perhaps we'll get that spelling later, Bishop.
Yes.
Perhaps if you could move the microphones a little closer to you. Thank you. Now, you taught canon law at the Catholic Institute of Sydney and served as the Secretary and then President of the Canon Law Society of Australia and New Zealand.
Yes, I did.
Was that an area of work that you had studied while at the seminary and in Rome?
It was he wrote a letter just saying study canon law. So that's what I did.
It wasn't
He wrote a letter just saying study canon law. So that's what I did.
It wasn't a particular interest of yours before you studied it?
It was not a subject I would ever have chosen.
Having had it chosen for you, Bishop, did you come to have a great interest in it?
That would be saying too much. I was always interested in, as it were, what was behind the law, the theology of the law, the purpose of the law, rather than in the details of the law itself, though I had to study those.
Now, in 1984, you were appointed auxiliary bishop in the Archdiocese of Sydney, and you held that position from 1984 to when?
Until the 14th of July 2004.
And that's when you retired.
That's when I retired.
And for the time that you were auxiliary bishop, you were also a member of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference.
Correct.
What work were you asked to do as auxiliary bishop?
Well, the basic job of an auxiliary bishop is to do whatever the Archbishop asks him to do.
There's a theme coming about this, isn't there, Bishop Robinson?
It involved fairly ordinary things. Like, at first I looked after a region, looked after the inner western region of Sydney. And, the usual things, confirmation, visitation of the parishes, keeping in touch with those parishes, what was happening. Then we were also given multiple portfolios, as it were. My biggest one was education. I was chairman of the schools board for the Archdiocese of Sydney. That was of 150 different schools. I later became chairman of the New South Wales Education Board of the Church. So that education, yes, took up a fair bit of time. But there were others. I was university chaplains, accommodation for the elderly, various other portfolios as well.
Thank you. Now, coming back...
Ms. Vanessa,
sorry.
Is the bishop being picked up?
Can we return to the 1970s, Bishop? You had been ordained in 1960. What work did you do in the 60s before you taught canon law?
I returned from Rome in 1965 after I'd finished my studies in canon law. I was immediately appointed to the parish of Croydon in 1965 after I'd finished my studies in canon law. I was immediately appointed to the parish of Croydon and was full-time there for the first 3 years. Then, and that's not even 3 years, slightly less than that, because in 1967, the man who'd done all the canon work in the diocese had a brought into canon law work in 1967. And in 1968, I was transferred. Immediately started being brought into canon law work in 1967. And in 1968, I was transferred from Croydon to Northbridge because it was halfway between the seminary at Manly where I lectured and the city where I worked in an office. And I was far more into canon law work from that time on.
Bishop, when you speak of canon law work, what do you mean? What does it encompass?
It involved teaching canon law to the seminary, and above all, in terms of time and energy, it meant working in the marriage tribunal. Other questions of canon law can come up that I was expected to research, but they were the big jobs.
Now, in the 1970s, did you do some work with a Father Eugene Hogan?
Yes, I did. He was a Vincentian priest, or at least 30 years older than myself. And he was given the direct job of processing the requests of a priest who left the ministry for a dispensation from all obligations, particularly so that he could get married. And I was asked to assist him in that, which is how I came to meet him. He was much older than myself and more involved at top level, so he knew a lot of things that I didn't. I mean, at that stage, I was a junior priest assisting, writing up he'd tell stories out of court. And yes, he did tell me stories as well. Sometimes, really, stories he shouldn't have.
What sort of stories?
Oh, about things he'd heard about what priests did and how that was handled.
Mm-hmm. What did he tell you about how things were handled?
Well, back in those days, and I'm talking solely of Sydney, and I'm conscious of my oath, and that here I'm repeating the not most reliable source in the world, so I can't swear to the truth of the details of what I say. I can only swear that this is what I heard. He told me particularly about one priest. I can give you his name if you like, or do you want his name? Or
Is this the priest who was involved in dealing with other priests who'd got themselves into trouble, or is this a priest who'd got himself into trouble?
This is a priest who got himself into trouble.
Perhaps we'll just call him AB.
Okay, I'll call him by his initials. His initials were TS.
Certainly.
Well, this is the story as it was told to me by Father Hogan. This priest was about 3 years senior to myself, so I do remember him from seminary days. He was not the brightest student in the place. Instead, he was probably the strongest, physically strongest. And that's where he found his self-identity. And my memories of him are always of lifting weights and pulling himself up on bars, and not athletic, but strength, just physical strength. Then he was ordained and sent out into a parish. And anyway, at a certain point, as I was told the story, he came across someone doing the wrong thing. And his solution to that was to revert to his strength, which was his physical strength. So he went up to the person and grabbed him by the genitals and squeezed. And it worked. The man stopped doing whatever it was he was doing. And he was pleased with this, and he started doing it a number of times. Became something of a pattern with him. Eventually, needless to say, this was referred to the police. And then the police commissioner and a particular priest in the Archdiocese of Sydney came together. It was referred to them.
Which particular
The
priest?
name of the priest was Monsignor Tom Wallace. He was, at that stage, the parish priest of Darlinghurst. And he had been given a job by Cardinal Gilroy to handle such matters. And as I understood it, this is what happened in those days, at least here in Sydney, that there was direct contact between Monsignor Wallace and the police commissioner, and they decided what would happen.
Just let me stop you there, so that when a complaint was made to the police about S's handling of people, that complaint was dealt with by the then police commissioner speaking to Father Tom Wallace from the Darlinghurst parish.
Correct.
Who had authority from Cardinal Gilroy to do such things.
To act in such matters. His brief, so far as I can tell, was to get rid of the problem, solve it, not just cover it up, get rid of it. In this particular case, what I was told was that the two of them got together and their first step was to take this priest out of the parish, and they sent him off to an institute for delinquent boys somewhere up on the Hawkesbury River.
Not as an inmate, but
as a
teacher.
chaplain. As a chaplain. So he went up there as a chaplain. The boys didn't give him any great welcome. They didn't want a chaplain there. And he wasn't getting far at all. So unfortunately, he reverted to former ways. And he picked out the biggest, strongest, meanest boy in the place and did the same thing to him, grabbed him by the genitals and squeezed. That was reported about. And so Monsignor Wallace came in again, and this time they really acted. The police commissioner insisted that he be got out of the state of New South Wales, and that if he ever set foot over the border again, he would instantly be arrested. And Monsignor Wallace got him out of the priesthood completely. His family may have known where he was, but certainly no one else did, no one in the church, even his closest friends. Never heard from him again. I'm not implying foul play, I'm just implying that they got him out of the state and out of the priesthood.
How did they get him out of the priesthood and accord with canon law?
Yeah, well, the whole point is it was not in accord with canon law. At best, it was outside the law. At worst, it was contrary to the law. Really, it was contrary to the law. There was no due process. There was no court hearing. They simply decided they knew the facts, that he had offended. They'd heard it from a number of people, and they acted. So they simply got rid of him, in effect.
So I take it there was no police charges laid against him?
That would be my understanding. There were no, well, I'm sure there were threats. Part of this would have been Tom Wallace speaking to this man, and he had a real raspy sandpaper tongue that would have torn strips off the man. But it didn't work. The man re-offended, and so they acted. They got rid of him. So it's, in one way it's cover-up, in another way it's more than cover-up. It's solving the problem, getting rid of it. And as I understand it, that was how Monsignor Wallace saw his job. Public knowledge was that, yes, it was Tom Wallace who handled all such issues. And we, the younger press, knew this, and we knew that we didn't want to fall into his hands. We would not be treated gently.
When you say he handled these issues, they clearly included physical assaults by priests. Did they also include sexual assaults?
I've no idea. Beyond that case, I have direct knowledge of individual cases. So I do not know whether this is what happened when a case of sexual abuse of a minor came up. I would suspect it was, but I can't swear to that.
Was there any other organised system in such that Monsignor Wallace had the authority of Cardinal to any other organised system in such that Monsignor Wallace had the authority of Cardinal to deal with complaints of child sexual abuse by clergy?
I really don't know.
Is it the case that it's likely that the Monsignor Wallace system applied in cases of complaints of sexual as well?
If one were talking about the possible arrest of a priest, for police.
So his role was primarily where a matter, be it sexual crime or physical crime, became known to the police?
Yes.
What was the policy purpose behind such an arrangement, do you think?
It was all part of, what one hears was the policy at the time, that it was not good for the community that so-called pillars of the community should be held up as morally corrupt. And my understanding was always that this applied not solely to Catholic priests. It applied to members of clergy of all denominations. It applied to judges, magistrates, senior politicians, senior public servants, such people, senior police, and that it was, such cases were handled quietly. The people weren't publicly arrested, they were threatened, and they were somehow removed. You know, sometimes one hears of cases where people weren't removed, but you know, it seemed to be a general policy in Australian society. How far back it goes, I couldn't tell you, and in how many other countries similar things were done, I also couldn't tell you.
How long did Monsignor Wallace carry out this role?
Well, I can't tell you when he started. It could have been as early as about 1960, until the end of the 70s. Then he had a leg amputated and he died not too long afterwards.
Did anyone take his place?
No, that's the point. No one took his place. That system came to an end. I can tell of a case of where that happened.
Just before you do, so when he became ill and died, there was no Tom Wallace put in place.
No.
Did it become clear that there was a situation where something was needed in the church to deal with such complaints after Tom Wallace left?
Well, there was a situation in the 80s where the system that had been there had been taken away and nothing had really been put in its place. And so I you know, again, so far as I know, this is really before my time. There was a number of different things done in the 80s, some of them better than others, some of them very poor. But as people struggled to find some way of responding.
Was there a particular example in the early 80s which showed the church that they needed to put a new system in place?
Well, there was certainly the case from Armidale.
Father F. Father F?
Father F, yes. And it was in 1983. My information here comes from Mr. Anthony Whitlam, QC, and the study that he was asked to do of this particular situation. Two parents came to see the bishop, Bishop Kennedy.
Bishop of Armidale.
Bishop of Armidale at that time. Now, for 20 years, he had worked in the Chancery in the Sydney Archdiocese. And he would have, in that position, he would have had a good idea of what Monsignor Wallace was doing. They were contemporaries. They were chalk and cheese. One was rough and gruff, and the other was Mr. Nice Guy. He was always, you know, yeah, he was a nice person. He was a wonderful number two man, you know, obeying the orders of the man above him who made the hard decisions, and then he would implement them in his very, very nice way. But it was a mistake to make him the number one man. He lacked the strength for it. And anyway, he found himself in Armidale. These parents came to see him, and they told him of the abuse of their son by this Father F. And it was clearly a shock to him. And Mr. Whitlam's report says that he told the couple that he had to leave the room for a while to make some phone calls. And he went out of the room after his study. Now, as soon as I read that, I said, I know exactly what you did. I cannot swear to this, of course, but I strongly believe it. He would have gone to his study and rung Sydney, and he would have asked, who's taken Tom Wallace's place? And he would have been told, no one has. That era's come to an end. That's not how things are handled any longer. So you'll have to do something different. And he would have asked, well, what do I do? What do I do? And they would have had no answer for him. Anyway, as Mr. Whitlam reports, he returned to the room and told the parents there was nothing he could do for them. You know, a really weak response. Later, he did a little bit more, as I've learned from documents, but still not nearly enough. But I think he was typical of basically a good man but a weak man, who really, once the only thing he'd ever known was taken away, had no idea how to proceed, and so gave this abysmally weak reply to the parents. That, I think, is typical of the early 80s, as people struggle to find ways to respond. Remember, I've told you about Sydney. I can't even guarantee that Monsignor Wallace was called into other dioceses in New South Wales, certainly not beyond New South Wales. In Victoria, they seem to have had far more trust in sending the priest, the offending priest, to a psychiatrist. And I think they were given assurances that they could cure the person. Well, whether the word cure was used, but they could change his behaviour. And they seem to have far more faith in that in Victoria. I learned this a bit later, but they did, than elsewhere. So different bishops were finding different solutions, and probably none of them very good.
Were there discussions, as far as you now know, between bishops from the southern state and bishops in New South Wales, or indeed relevant archbishops, talking about how they respectively handle these matters? This is in the early to mid-80s?
I don't know, is the only honest answer I can give there. I was never part of, I was never driven to such conversations. There could have been discussions, but it could also have been that they just didn't share. They kept to themselves how they were handling them, and that could have reflected a realisation that they were not handling them well.
Was anyone put in the place of Monsignor Wallace before the matter came to a head in late 1987?
No. There was never anyone that I knew of that took on his role. And certainly no one who just walked over the top of state law and church law and just got rid of someone.
Now, by November 1987, you had been a member of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference for a couple of years.
3.5 years, yes.
And at the November meeting, there was a discussion about child sexual abuse by clergy. Is that right?
It was an evening session, an added-on session, but everyone turned up. And two priests, Father John Asher and Father Brian Lucas, spoke to us about the problem. The sources of their information I can't give you, but they'd clearly made some studies and learned something from overseas as well. And they gave us this talk in November 87. It was a considerable shock to me, and I believe to many of the other bishops as well, because for the first time it showed us that this was a large-scale problem, present in most places and in most countries, and that I found incredibly shocking. I mean, as late as November 87, I really had no idea that priests could do such things. I'd only heard snippets before that, and now here was the presentation that you couldn't deny that it was a large-scale problem.
Now, they followed that up with a formal presentation in April the following year,
yes.
1988.
Yeah.
And we might just have on the screen tab 1. Now, this is a... do you have it in front of you?
Yes,
That
yes.
one's either on the screen or the hard copy, whatever suits.
Yeah, I have both.
Bishop. And the document on the screen is dated 12 April 1988, and John Usher and Brian Lucas's names appear on the top.
Yes.
And if you just scroll down, you can see that it provides facts as to the numbers of boys and girls sexually assaulted, and that 1 in 10 priests would have been victims,
Yes.
and 50% have potential to be offenders. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And then it comes down further to the law, and it talks about mandatory reporting, and at that stage how many priests and brothers, known and unknown, had been charged. And then there's the question that's raised of priesthood and the media, who were said to be awaiting every opportunity. Now, further down, there's reference to offences, reference to problems.
Yes.
And there's discussion about various offences and some comments made about pedophiles being chronic liars. Do you see that? Are these matters that you recall from the presentation?
Whether I can recall that sort of specific, we would all have wanted something in writing like this, which is, I presume, why this was produced. I mean, I note that there were actually some very good things here, that pedophiles are chronic liars, that those generally notified have committed many offences, and that a change of parish doesn't cure affliction. It's good that we were told things like that right from the beginning.
And they're all matters that you know now,
Yeah.
from your experience, to be true. We can just scroll down, or no, perhaps to the previous page, but scroll down that page to the end of that page. And the advice there is that the bishop must be able to demonstrate to the community and secular law that he's taken some action, and that community climate is to scrutinise men in positions of trust. And then there's advice about acting prudently. Now, if we can just turn over to the next page, the situation is described, and the second last dash under that is that bishops must not be caught in cover-up by getting the offender out of the way. You see that?
Yeah.
So that was an issue that was front and centre in 1988 about what the response of the church should be to such allegations. Now, further down under the heading of confidentiality of church process, there's reference to instructing the diocesan solicitor. Now, that was the general approach in those days, wasn't it, if a complaint came in to involve the church's lawyers?
Yes, I would say from what I've heard that was a general response.
Now, if we can just turn to the second tab.
Well, just before you do, Bishop, there's an issue about documents referred to under the confidentiality heading. Do you see that on the document, the second dot point? Instruct the diocesan solicitor and give him the documentation, which then becomes, from my copy of the document, something's missing. But I assume the word is privileged.
Oh, I would assume the word is privileged too, Your Honour.
Yeah. Did you understand what you were being told was to, in order to keep documents confidential, the device was to send them to a solicitor?
Look, I would not. I find it difficult to comment now as to what I understood or knew then. Now, when I read that, of course, it jumps to mind. He's saying this is a means of keeping them confidential. Yes, it's hard to avoid that. Whether I probably understood that at the time.
Yeah. Yes, very well.
Perhaps if we can turn to the next tab, that's tab 2, Bishop. This is dated the same day and refers to brief notes prepared by Father Lucas. What role did Father Lucas have in the church at this stage?
At this stage, nothing much. He was a priest of the Archdiocese of Sydney. It was well known of Sydney. It was well known that he was a lawyer before he became a priest. But I don't think he wouldn't have gone to the chancery by that age, so he would have been in the parish somewhere.
Do you recall being provided with these notes as part of either the discussion at the meeting in April or subsequently?
I assume I was provided with these notes.
Now, if we can go to the second page, there's a heading of canon law, and the last paragraph refers to confidentiality of the canonical process, and a procedure is suggested, and this goes to His Honour's question. As soon as there's a complaint, the church authority briefs its lawyers and advises them, and then the lawyers advise them of the possibility, the lawyers are advised of the possibility of a claim, and they in turn instruct the church to make inquiries. And then it says all documentation created from that time forms part of the report, is incorporated into the correspondence, and hopefully attracts legal privilege. Do you see that?
Yes.
Remember that being a prime topic of conversation at the time? That is how there can be a response from the church to such allegations in such a way as the response can be kept confidential.
It makes explicit what was implicit in the earlier one, doesn't it? And it is pretty explicit. No, I don't remember discussion from 1988. I suppose my overwhelming thing, I was still absorbing the fact, that this problem existed and that it existed on a wide scale. I don't remember this being a topic of conversation.
Now, you've said that you were shocked when you first heard about AIL in November 1987, and then with the formal presentation in April 1988, that was reinforced.
Yes.
What was the response of those around you on both of those occasions? That is, the other bishops.
What I remember is that yes, I had to respond to this. It couldn't be ignored. And then the practical response was what the conference always did: it set up a committee. I mean, yes, but he had set up a committee to look specifically at this and to come, everything worked through committees.
Did any of the bishops to you, or more generally, say that they've known about this problem for some time, they've been having to struggle to deal with it for their diocese?
No, I do not remember anyone using that language. I later learned that to be true, but I cannot remember it from that time.
So the discussion, to the extent there was a discussion, was more about how horrible this is and what can we do to fix it.
Yes, so let's appoint a committee with a specific charge to look into this and come back to us with recommendations.
So that was the Special Issues Committee?
That was the Special Issues Committee.
And that was established in 1988?
Yes.
Now, who was the first chair of the Special Issues Committee?
Well, I understand it was Bishop Mulcairns.
Now, Bishop Mulcairns was the Bishop of Ballarat at the time,
Yes.
wasn't he? How was he selected?
All people were selected through there was a membership panel, and they would put up names, and then we would choose from those names.
What did you know of Bishop Mulcairns at this time, 1988?
I knew nothing at all of what may have gone on in the Ballarat diocese. I knew him at that stage as actually one of the more forward-looking bishops. I would well have voted for him. I respected him. I thought he would be one to look into this and come back with good ideas.
During the course of electing Bishop Mulcairns, did he say to those voting, look, I actually know a lot about this because I've had a few priests who have been problematic?
No, not that I remember.
He didn't share with you his way of dealing with priests
No.
in his diocese?
Not that I remember, no.
Now, if we can have tab 3 on the screen, if you could just turn over to tab 3. And we can go to the page with number 16 at the top, which is 1437, with the barcode reference. Now, this was the motion that you described as establishing a committee, and the function is set out below. And if we can scroll up so the function's on the screen, thank you. So it's to act as a resource in connection with legal proceedings and to advise about legal proceedings and to monitor legal proceedings, and then further to identify issues of concern in relation to those legal proceedings. So it seems from that its function was very much after a complaint had been received and that complaint had been transformed into legal proceedings. Is that right to think of it in those terms?
When I look back now, I find the function of this committee to be fairly restricted. I would have preferred that it had been given a broader mandate to try to look at the whole problem and come up with more holistic responses.
Well, it was also had the function of ascertaining available treatment options. Do you see that further down?
Yes.
And that may well have come from the Victorian bishops.
Could indeed.
Because as
yes.
And that may well have come from the Victorian bishops.
Could indeed.
Because as you understood it at that time, they were using treatment options.
Well, I certainly came to understand that.
And then further down, the role was to a protocol.
Yes.
And then to identify the needs of clergy to the extent it's relevant to legal proceedings. Do you see that?
Yes.
So you'd now describe that as a limited set of functions.
Well, I mean, all in favour of the ongoing education of clergy in this field, but not solely as it's relevant to legal proceedings.
Now, if we can just turn over, there's reference there to reporting at least annually to the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. Now, you weren't a member of that committee.
I was not a member of this committee, no.
And as you've described it, the Church worked very much on the basis of committees and those committees having responsibility for various areas.
Yes, there were, from memory, 19 different committees, and the members of those committees were supposed to be in touch with the people in this field. Some of them had a permanent secretariat, others didn't. This one would not have at the beginning, but they were supposed to talk, well outside the bishops and then come back with ideas for the conference.
Did you have any expectation at this time as to how long the work of the committee might take?
Well, I would have wanted some answers fairly quick. Have the perfect response to every aspect of sexual abuse. Of course you don't. So in one sense it would take forever, but I wanted some things to come back fairly quickly.
Well, I think you got a draft protocol in late 1989.
Yeah.
Was that a time frame that was acceptable to you?
Committees were generally a bit slow in their work. The bishops only met twice a year, so the work of the committee only came together twice a year. So yes, that was probably a reasonable time frame to come up with a protocol.
Do you have any recollection now about that protocol?
Sorry?
Do you have any recollection now about the extent of that protocol?
Only in the sense that I've now read again the protocol that they came up with.
Did you find that helpful in the work that you later did in the 90s in this area?
Not really. When I was charged with drafting something, I looked at what was there and I couldn't find anything anywhere which really answered my problems with this protocol. It's too oriented to priests rather than to victims. It envisages each diocese setting up its own, whatever we call it, response, and I never wanted that. From the time I first started I wanted one response for the whole country, so that we were truly working together. I thought as long as each bishop was doing his own thing, we would never have a consistent answer. We would never have a good answer. So I did find serious gaps in this protocol once I sat down to draft something myself.
The protocol, as you understand it, went out for consultation among other bishops and priests.
Yes.
And as the minutes record, that in about mid-1990, only one bishop had responded and two religious major superiors had made comments.
Yeah.
Why was there, do you think, such a poor response?
I can't answer. For myself, I would not have answered because I was an auxiliary bishop. I wasn't handling such cases. They were essentially the diocese had to. I suppose the trust in the committee system that they would come up with something worthwhile. I really can't answer why so few commented at that time.
Surprise you?
Yes. Well, yes and no. They were pretty slow to respond to most sorts of things.
Did it reflect a lack of interest in the topic?
Not entirely. Remember, we were talking about, I must say, very busy people.
Yes.
Who had a whole lot of other things on their plate. And therefore tended to say, well, this has been looked after by that committee, which was set up for this purpose, so I'll let them get on with it.
Now, there was one response, and if we can have tab 9 on the screen. This is a letter to Bishop Mulcairns as chair of the committee, and it's signed by Nicholas Tonti Filippini.
Filippini, yeah.
Now, what was his job at the time? This is August 1990.
Nick Tonti Filippini is a man I greatly respected. He was an ethicist, and he had a job as the research officer for the conference. As such, he, all the documents were available to him, and he clearly looked through this one, and he found some serious gaps. And, by and large, I agree with what he's written.
Well, if we go to page 5 of his document, where he summarises his major concerns with the protocol, you can just scroll down. Now, his first one is no separation between counselling and investigation. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And that, I think, was having regard to the fact that the counselling function provided information that was relevant to the investigation.
Well, there is a certain confusion between the two in the document that they came up with. It was hard at times to see where counselling stopped and investigation began.
There's reference to mandatory reporting and that there's a grave risk of scandal if the New South Wales exemption for clergy had more wide application. Now, was that something you shared?
No, something I yes, something I. Whether I was fully aware of these things at that time, certainly later I came to see that and to be totally against any use of that privilege that had been given in order to escape from scrutiny. And so yes, I certainly came to agree with what he said.
He's then in C referring to a moral obligation to seek to bring a criminal to justice.
Yes.
Now, that was an ongoing issue, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes. Bishops relied on their priests. A bishop who loses the support of his priest is a most ineffective bishop. And we've had examples of that in recent times. Where, we don't have to go beyond Sydney. Under a certain recent archbishop, the most common word you might have heard was disengagement. Priests simply forgot the diocese, put their heads down and looked after their parishes because that particular bishop had lost the support of his priests.
Who are you referring to?
Cardinal Pell. he'd lost the support of the majority of his priests, and that alone made him a most ineffective bishop. So there is bishops demand loyalty from priests, but they also know, most of them anyway, the good ones, that therefore they have to be loyal in return. So that was a powerful thing. I see it with some bishops more. This sense of having to be loyal to the priests did lead to cover-ups and moving rounds, and I believe it would be true of Bishop Mulcairn's particularly.
When you say that Cardinal Pell had lost the support of the majority of his priests, what are you referring to?
The majority of the priests wished he'd get transferred somewhere else.
And you say that because you had conversations with the majority of priests and you were the auxiliary bishop?
Yes.
What do you mean by disengagement?
Disengaging with things diocesan, with things the bishop was doing, and simply concentrating on one's own parish and looking after that. So that the diocese became separate parishes rather than any unified body. And
what was the effect of that?
Alas, a lack of effectiveness, a lack of diocesan unity, a lack of working together, a lack of real loyalty to the bishop. It was a difficult time.
Were there consequences that you can describe to us from that situation?
Might be hard to point and say this, this and this, but I was constantly made aware of priests adopting that solution. I'll forget what the diocese is doing, I'll look after my parish, and that's what I'll do.
And in looking after one's own parish, does that, with it, a support for priests within the parish rather than having those priests, if they misconduct themselves, being referred to some greater body within the archdiocese?
I would have to say that large numbers of priests did not respond well to the whole phenomenon of abuse. They tended to be pro-priest and, to that extent at least, anti-victim. But they did tend to be pro-priest and to stick together and support their, and to disbelieve a lot of the accusations, simply to believe a priest who said, "I'm innocent." That I found was quite strong.
And did you put that down, at least in part, to wanting to protect what they considered to be the good name of the church and reputation of the church?
Partly. Partly it was a more specific thing. It was protecting their brother priests and hence protecting themselves.
Do you think that if the...
You know, it was hard to accept that fellow priests had done such things, including people you'd known for 30, 40 years and had worked with and studied with and played with. That was not easy.
Do you think that if the various parishes had worked together better under a different leadership, there might have been a different response?
Depending on who that bishop was and what response he gave to sexual abuse. You know, the messages the bishop gave out were important. Just as for the entire church, I've always maintained the messages the Pope's been giving out have been very important. And I think that some popes gave out the wrong message.
And some archbishops.
Oh, and some archbishops.
Has that changed now?
It's certainly changing. The full extent to which it has changed is hard to gauge.
Well, let me take you back to the 1990s, if I can. The researcher, Nicholas Tonti Filippini, wrote his letter, and then there were various further editions of the protocol which were developed subject of consultation and adopted or otherwise by the Bishops' Conference. And then there was a time in December 1992 when Father Lucas addressed the conference on his study trip to North America. Do you remember that?
Vaguely.
You don't remember any particular learnings from that time?
Oh, his overall message was that, this problem is in many other countries. Canada seemed to be the worst of all. It was ahead of us. It had had some really gruesome stories, particularly of a large orphanage in Newfoundland. So bad that, as I understand it, that entire building has now been simply razed to the ground, so that even the physical memory of the buildings is gone. And that was the worst story I heard up to that time, because it seemed that the people abusing within there had to have known about each other. And so it was almost a group offence, and that really shocked me.
There was also discussion on the first draft pastoral statement on child protection, and there was some discussion and debate about the precise terms that pastoral statement should have. Do you remember that?
I don't remember it. I read these documents again, and yes, they come from the time they come from.
And if we can have tab 17 on the screen, at 1859. It's the second last page. Bishop?
Yeah.
No, it's the previous page. Now, there's reference here to the pastoral statement, and you'll see in the fourth paragraph there's reference to, in the past, lacking the knowledge provided by the modern behavioural sciences. Is that how you would see the fact that the Church responded quite late in the piece to these events? The lack of that knowledge?
Well, clearly the response was slow. Can I say at this stage, in making any comments here, I'm not trying to put myself above the rest and saying I realise all these things and those other people didn't. I took time, years, to come to terms with a lot of this and to respond properly. You gave me all these documents to read, and there's one in particular that shocks me, because it comes from as late as 1996, and I found myself using excusatory language, and it shocked me that late I was still doing that. Now, at long last, I would be well beyond it, but I was there with the rest of them. I was not way out ahead, seeing everything that was wrong and responding. I never wished to claim that or to say that about myself. I was one of them, with all their slowness.
Now, also at that meeting, the therapy centre or a program,
Yes.
and not surprisingly, a subcommittee was established to do that.
Yes.
And you subsequently became quite involved in a program which was called ultimately Encompass.
Later, yes, from 1994 on.
And that was first raised as part of the functions of the Special Issues Committee in 1988.
Yes.
So it took 4 years for that to come to the extent of a subcommittee.
No, I think there was more than one subcommittee. They first of all looked at, what was available. And I remember particularly they went to the John of God brothers, whose special apostolate was hospitals, and who did look after psychological problems as well as physical ones. They have 2 hospitals in Sydney, one at Burwood, one at North Richmond, and particularly the one at North Richmond does deal with various kinds of psychosexual problems. So they looked there, and then they started looking overseas, and so it did take years before they came up with the model that we've eventually.
Now, in April 1994, so a year or so after, there was a motion at the conference that there be a new bishops' committee established. Why did that come about?
There was certainly a concern about the name. It was felt that Special Issues was covering up, that it was, it wasn't being honest in saying what this really was about. At the same time, they didn't want to call it the Sex Committee or something because it always was more than that. It was looking at all aspects of professional standards. So they came to that name. That was part of it, that we needed a new committee with a new name. I think it's also true to say that there was a feeling, I'm always hesitant about my memory of events of 23 years ago. But there was a feeling, I believe, among the bishops that this was going too slowly. It really wasn't coming up. And in the meantime, the phrase I used was the city is burning. And you can't sit down with a committee when the city is burning. You've got to do things. And I think there was a feeling that the committee there really wasn't producing what we needed.
So you set up another committee?
So we changed the committee. We abolished the earlier one. We replaced the committee.
And you had a position on this committee, which you hadn't had on the previous committee?
This is correct. I was approached by the chairman of the membership panel, who got hold of me in a corridor one day. We're electing this new committee. We'd like you to stand for it. They're not producing what we need, and we want you to get in there and stir it up and get it moving. They're not producing what we need. And we want you to get in there and stir it up and get it moving.
What were your... and what areas needed moving?
Well, we certainly needed a response to claims of abuse. So that would have been a very high priority. At the same time, I think even then I would have realised that's not enough. We need to, in a way for the first time, look at the whole problem and try to come up with some holistic response to it. So look at aspects besides simply responding to complaints. I could have some holistic response to it. So look at aspects besides simply responding to complaints. I couldn't have probably listed them all at that particular moment, but I did believe we needed more.
At this stage, were you concerned about how canon law operated?
Yes. When I sat down to start drafting a response to complaints, what became Towards Healing, I looked at what was there, and I saw the police and their role, but I quickly became aware that the majority of complainants did not wish to go to the police. The majority, and in fact I think a large majority. Now they gave various reasons. There were 2 in particular. One was the fear that if they went to the police, their particular case would become public. And many of them, some of them, even their husband or wife, didn't know they'd been abused, and they certainly didn't want it to come out. And they feared that it would if they went to the police. The second great fear was of being cross-examined by an opposing barrister, and they definitely didn't want that. Whatever the reasons and whether they were justified or not, this was what it, overwhelmingly they did not want to go there. So I said the police are not the total solution to this question. That wasn't good enough. We had to give some response. We had to hear and deal with their application, their complaint. So then I looked at Shaw, and I found that it just didn't meet the problem. The first one was the subscription or statute of limitations. At that stage, it was 5 years from the time of the offence. But I said, if someone's...
So just to explain what that means, that you could only...
bring forward a complaint to a church tribunal within 5 years of the offence.
So if the offence happened when the child was 7,
That's
they had to
right.
make the complaint by age 12.
By the time they were 12. And that was just so totally unrealistic, it was not there. I had other problems too. We'll probably get onto this later, but first it was the nature of a church tribunal. If it was a priest, there had to be 3 judges, all priests. There had to be a promoter of justice, a priest, and even the notary had to be a priest. And it meant a victim would have to front up to 5 priests in black suits. Well, that simply wasn't on either. Plus, the tribunal to deal with sexual abuse was really one set up to deal with other kinds of offences. And it was the needs of those offences which were dictating what would happen, and they were quite unrealistic and out of...
What sort of other offences?
Oh, things like a priest celebrating Mass with only bread but not wine, a priest breaking the seal of confessional, a priest celebrating a Mass with a Protestant minister, this kind, things of that nature, for which, for example, there may have been a reason to have a statute of limitations. But to apply that to abuse was just totally wrong. And I felt then and felt from ever after there needed to be some process set up which dealt specifically with this question. So I fairly quickly concluded, no, church law is no good for me. Then I looked at the protocol that was there, and I read it carefully and said, no, this can't help either. It's still having each bishop set up something for his own diocese, and that alone would mean 32 different systems in Australia, plus each religious order, and there are 150 of those. And that would cause total confusion. So I quite early became absolutely convinced it needed one for the entire country. We all committed to and all worked with together. And that's what I therefore set out to write. So that in relation to the response to complaints, they were some of the major things going on in my own mind.
Thank you. Bishop, we can take an adjournment now if you would like.
Is this your normal time?
Yes, would that suit you?
Okay, then fine.
Well, let me know when we're ready.
Thank you.